Good day and welcome to this third clip on the key concepts in constitutional law as explained in the Heringa book. And in this third session, we're going to look at the division of power again. Last week, we looked at the horizontal division of power between the legislature, the executive, the judiciary. And what we're going to look at this week is, if you wish, the vertical division of power. How do states organize themselves vertically in order to ensure that nobody has all the power in a country? And a key division there is that between federal and unitary states. Unitary states are states that can devolve powers to lower bodies, but can also always take those powers back again. So in that sense, the unitary character is guaranteed by the Constitution. Federal systems are characterized by the fact that there are independent states and there's a federal authority, and the position of those states, the autonomy of those states, is guaranteed by a whole host of mechanisms. Heringa names 7 features of federal states, whereas one is the division of territory. Of course, you can also have states in which power is spread, but more over religious entities, for instance. But here, federal states are about the division of territory. Another key feature is the regional autonomy, so that these states have a degree of autonomy. Another feature is that of federal supremacy. If you only have states who get together and agree to work together for certain purposes, but who hold all the power themselves, we're talking about a confederation and not about a federal state. Another really important thing that you see in all federal states is the idea of regional representation, so that in the legislative bodies of the federal state, you'll see some kind of representation of the regions, and we'll see a lot of examples of that. Another key feature of federal states is the fact that the prerogatives of these states, what they are allowed to do, is codified in the Constitution. It's laid down in the Constitution. It can't just be taken away. And another way of securing really the power of the regions is by giving them a say in constitutional amendment. So if the Constitution is to be amended in a federal system, you need to have the regions on board. And finally, what you see in all federal systems is that in order to mediate in disputes between the federal state and the other states, the subnational states, there's a constitutional court. There's some court to mediate between these disputes. Well, between unitary and federal states, completely unitary, completely federal states, there's of course many shades of grey, as we see in the 6 cases discussed in the book, and as we see in many of the cases that you will be looking at. There are different ways also of classifying unitary and federal states. And that's by looking, for instance, at the difference between integrative federalism and devolutionary or centrifugal federalism. In integrative federalism, long time ago, you had the states. They were all autonomous. There were kingdoms. There were count areas. There were provinces by themselves, and they agreed to pool their power to come together to form a federal state. As you see, for instance, in the European Union, as you see in the US, as you see in Germany, the state has worked towards integration. Now, there's also another mechanism that's possible in devolutionary or centrifugal states, where there was once a central state, a unitary state, that has really devolved powers to subnational units to the extent that it became a federal state. This, for instance, you see in India, where because of also pressures by the state has become federal. So this is an example of a devolutionary or centrifugal state. Another distinction to know in talking about federalism and federations is that there's so-called symmetrical federations and asymmetrical federations. Now, what's a symmetrical federation? A symmetrical federation is a federation in which each region has equal powers, equal legislative powers, equal autonomy. What you also see is federations in which different regions have very different powers, where some is nearly totally autonomous and where others have certain linguistic powers, for instance, so where you have very different kinds of devolution of powers to subnational units. As for instance, you see in Corsica, which has much more powers than another French region. So, and another distinction is symmetrical and asymmetrical forms of federalism. It might be good to say something about the difference between devolution and decentralization of powers. So unitary states, federal states, they can devolve powers, and they can also decentralize. Now, if you're talking about devolution of powers, a unitary state, for instance, really gives legislative powers to the subnational units, as was the case, for instance, in the United Kingdom, in putting in place the Scotland Act, where important powers were devolved to the four subnational units of the United Kingdom. Decentralization goes less far. Decentralization is merely making subnational units responsible for implementing national legislation. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, social welfare is decentralized. There's a National Social Care Act passed nationally, which says that the municipalities in this case are responsible for implementing this national act. Now, this pure implementation is called decentralization. Well, as said, there's big differences between the states that we're looking at in terms of the degree of federalism or of unitary character, the way in which all different subnational units are represented in and interact with the national state. And this is what we'll be looking at this week when we look at federal and unitary states. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.